you ever get a flat tire on the rear wheel of the bike, it's not as simple as changing a flat tire on a regular bike would be, as there is a motor and the caliper is in the way. So the tools you're going to need is an 18mm wrench for the axle nuts. A crescent wrench works for that as well. A 10mm wrench helps dig the axle out of the frame. After a lot of use, it tends to get stuck in there, so this helps. To remove the caliper, the 5mm Allen key is what you're going to need. Wire cutters to cut the zip ties, some more zip ties, and a tire lever. So when you're changing the tire, I have a bike stand, but you can just lay a towel down, flip the bike over. That works just fine. The first step you're going to do is clip the zip ties right here, just these two. And then from here, you can unplug it. Then you can remove these little rubber grommets, which exposes the axle nuts. So before we remove the axle nuts, the first thing we need to do is get this caliper out of the way. If you try and take the wheel off without removing this, the rotor is going to keep hitting the top of it and it's just going to be stuck. So you don't need to touch these top bolts on here. All you need to do is remove these two bolts. And then this just swings out of the way. While the caliper is off the bike and the wheel is off the bike, you don't want to squeeze the lever because it'll squeeze the pads in, and you'll need a flathead screwdriver to push them back into place. And then for this part, all you're going to do is loosen the axle nut just enough for it to clear the frame. Same thing over here on the other side. And at this point, what I'm going to do is get my 10mm Allen wrench. And if you look here, if I put it around the flat parts of the axle and tilt back, that helps free up the axle and it'll make it a lot easier to pull it out of the dropout. Once you've done all that, the wheel slides right out. I'm going to take the chain off the freewheel. Now we have the wheel off, and we're going to remove the tire, change the tube, and put it all back together. Is get it under the bead. Once I have it like that, takes the bead right off. Take your old tube out. And then your new tube is going to go right in its place. Get the valve through the valve hole. And just push the tube inside the rim. Now at this point, I'm going to re-bead this, and I can just go around with my thumbs till it beads up like that. Now we can actually inflate it. I'm going to do a low pressure first and then go around and make sure that none of the bead is coming undone. You can see right there. That's what you don't want. If I pump this up any further, the tube's going to blow up. So in that case, I'm going to air out a little bit. And then push this back into the rim. And then that's good. And we can continue pumping this up to 45 psi. Now that we have the tube changed, I'm just going to show you guys the order of the axle hardware. So on here we have the drive side with the freewheel. Here we have the non-drive side with the rotor. So if you look on the axle, there's a little cutout for the wire to feed through. You want that on the Model C and S facing up when the bike is right side up, and on the X and Y you want this facing down. So first things first, we're going to start with the axle washer, or a torque washer. And this is a really important part of the bike. It prevents the frame from getting damaged when you're using the motor. So I'm going to slide that on with the lug facing outward. And I'm gonna have the lug facing the opposite direction of where that cutout was. So here's the cutout, and there's the lug of the torque washer. Next is the axle nut. That's fine. And then for the non-drive side, I'm gonna start with this axle washer. Different from a torque washer, but that's gonna go on first. Then my torque washer is gonna go on with the lug facing in the same direction as the other side. So here's the rotor. The lug is facing outward towards that way, and it's on this side of the axle. Then the axle nut comes on as well. Okay, so I got my wheel. The first thing I'm gonna do is grab the chain, feed the wire through it, and then wrap it around the freewheel so it's around all of its teeth. Now the next part, we're just gonna put this into the axle dropouts. It's a little tight, so I usually let it rest on top, and then on one side, I'll just push the frame over a little bit, and it drops right in like that. The wheel in the dropout, but as you can see, it's not aligned properly. There's a lot more space over here than there is over here. So while the axle nuts are loose, just center it to the best of your ability, and then hand tighten the axle nuts while keeping it centered. And I'm gonna get my wrench, and I'm just gonna give it maybe a quarter to a half turn. It's still centered. Now the next thing I'm gonna check for is the chain tension. So I'm gonna spring this all the way around, seeing if the chain tension is too loose. See, right about there, you can see that the chain moves quite a bit. I wanna tighten that up, so I'm gonna loosen this again. Recenter it while pushing down, and then give it another half turn. Chain is tighter, that's acceptable. And then now what I'm gonna do is just alternate between tightening sides. And that would be good. So here I have a torque wrench, and it's set at 30 Newton meters. With this socket, we can't check the torque of the drive side since the motor wire is there. But on this side, I'm just gonna tighten up until it clicks. So 30 Newton meters for this side. On this side, you want about the same, but since you can't measure it directly, pretty snug. And then the last part is putting the caliper back on. So I got my caliper bolts and my 5mm Allen key. I'm gonna center the pads over the rotor. And then I'm gonna tighten this down. You see how it's slotted? What you wanna keep it at is just dead center. And the best way to do that is to tighten one bolt down so it gets centered. And now you can focus on this one. And I'm gonna grab my torque wrench again and set it for 8 Newton meters. And then what I'm gonna do is spin the wheel and make sure that there's no rotor rub. And what that is just a misalignment between the pads and the rotor. So I can hear there's a little bit of rotor rub. That's when we're gonna go to these two top bolts. I'm gonna look down and see if I can see where it's rubbing. So it's rubbing on the top left pad. I'm just gonna loosen up the top caliper bolt, slide it over just a tad. You wanna do this in increments. Spin it again, no rotor rub. So now all I'm gonna do is just put these caps back. The smaller one goes on the non-drive side. you're gonna wanna push this wire coil back into here. And then this feeds on through the wire, pops right back into place. And now it's time to connect the wires. And if you look, it's a little hard to see, but there is an arrow on the male plug and an arrow on the female plug. You want to make sure that those line up before you plug them together, or else you could damage the motor pins. So I've got them facing straight at each other, wires or arrows are lined up. Now I just plug them together, and then at this point you would just zip tie it to these two tabs and you're good to go.